These promises strong as a spell. I'll never tell. Yeah, I like you.
Hi guys, welcome back to exmolex. I am an ex-Mormon. I was a member of the Mormon church for 25 years, and I have now been an ex-member of the church for almost 5 years. When I was a member of the Mormon church, I held callings in all of the young women's presidencies, as well as in youth stake leadership callings, and then later as a primary teacher and a Relief Society teacher. And if you're familiar at all with my channel, you've probably realized that it's important to me to humanize ex-Mormons. Within the church, as I can attest from my time there has been a lot of dehumanizing of people who choose to leave the Mormon church. We're called lazy learners. Members of the church are told that we didn't have strong testimonies. It's pretty universally and widely accepted that people who leave the church did not have strong faith. And once you're on the outside, especially if you're outspoken about it like I am, you receive a lot of hate for that. You are a black sheep. You are a barking dog nipping at the heels of the weary travelers. You didn't hold on to the iron rod and now you are a part of the great and spacious building. You're an apostate. With today's video, I'm hoping to show people who watch, be they ex-Mormons or Mormons alike, that people who choose to leave the church are just regular people. Regular members of the Mormon church choose to leave. I asked on a bunch of my different social media platforms, one, what was the highest calling you received while you were a member of the church? And two, if you could sum it up for me, why did you choose to leave the church? I want to read some of those responses for you today. And thank you to anybody who shared. Branch president while on my mission. I left because I studied church history and learned all the things that the Quorum of the 15, the leaders of the church, don't want regular members to know. My shelf broke when I was reading the comparisons of the late war and the Book of Mormon. The word-for-word plagiarism by Joseph Smith made my shelf crash down hard, and now my life is better for it. Ward finance clerk would be my highest, I suppose. I only left early this year. Quite simply, I learned that it's not true. Was second counselor in the bishopric and then went to the high council. Physically in, mentally out now, but church history, biblical studies, all the domino effect, knowing the history of the Bible and religion in general. I've been in the bishopric 3 times. I was preparing for a senior mission when the gospel topics essays were released. I learned all that the anti-Mormon lies were in fact historical truths. I resigned at age 60 after paying tithing for 40 years. Elders Quorum president. Social issues such as the current and past policies on LGBTQ and race drove me out. Also learning about strong arguments for the origin of the Book of Mormon outside the official narrative. Moroni was a port city that Captain Kidd would frequent, and Joseph Smith was enthralled by Captain Kidd. Stuff like that. Elders Quorum president, Sunday school president, and gospel doctrine teacher. After 36 years fully active, faithful service, the church banned me from church property all because I have Tourette syndrome, and they are offended by my socially inappropriate tics. They had church legal send a letter threatening to have law enforcement trespass me from church property, all because of my disability, Tourette's. After getting banned, I had a lot of free time to study church history. Once I saw the horrific details of racism and polygamy, I was done and removed my name from church records a few months later. This all happened within the past year. Can I just stop for a second and say that I am so sorry that you experienced that? That is ableism at its finest, and I can't believe that nobody within the church recognized that and was like, hang on a second, this is somebody's disability. This is something that they cannot help. This is, I mean, it boggles my mind that there were enough people who approved this happening to let that pass. But I guess in the end, I'm glad that you ended up doing more research into the church and leaving it, but it's awful that you had to experience that at all. Elders Quorum president, ordained as a member of the 70 weeks before Kimball changed that. Left after reading Fawn Brody's book and others. Online searching did it to me. Gospel doctrine teacher. Realizing that the church's cultural stranglehold on receiving a true witness and the spirit of discernment was illusory. The idea that my impressions from God were above that of any other Christian wasn't supported by anything, but was rather a generational, ego-driven cope handed down to me by my parents and other members. In effect, it protected my intellectual mind from the insecurity of faith. So without it, Mormonism was no longer special. I no longer had a loophole. The whole world of ideas opened up to me, calling for equal consideration. I love that, and beautifully phrased. My highest calling was the second counselor in the bishopric. It was while serving in that calling that my faith in Mormonism began to crumble. I was at the height of my faith going into that calling. I started digging into church history, and down the rabbit hole I went. It took 4 more years before I said to myself, the church isn't true. The very first time in my life I had said those words. That was in 2015. Highest calling, Relief Society president. Why I left? Originally, because it wasn't a place I could be happy. Then also because it is a largely harmful, fraudulent organization with no morals. First counselor in the primary presidency. I no longer believe in the truth claims of the LDS Church because there is no way I could believe that the God that gave the revelation in D&C 132 is a loving father. Therefore, Joseph Smith lied. Once the door opened to one lie, everything was quickly exposed as lies told to gain power, property, and women by a disgusting con artist. Ward organist in the Relief Society presidency. I left the church because of the threat it had on my loved ones. My best friend came out to me and was scared I'd choose the church over her. I didn't want to be part of something that made my loved ones scared to lose me. I have no regrets leaving. Relief Society president. I had been feeling off in church but was active and devout. Ultimately, it was when they banned kids of gay people being baptized. I studied and prayed to understand, but I could never convince myself it wasn't wrong and didn't make sense. Second article of faith? Then I slowly started to research more and found the CES letter, and it really was over. Primary president. I left because it was a religion I was born into, one my ancestors chose, and I didn't choose for myself. I didn't like that the church history I was taught is so different than what is surfacing now. Also, the number of members says it all. Mormons are just a grain in a 25-pound bag of rice. They claim they are the only true church, yet they are very, very few in number. I missed out on a lot of my young adult life and on a career, something I will never get back. I am changing my life so my kids actually get to live who they truly are without the Mormon influence. Relief Society president. I left the church because after painfully, obsessively studying CES letter, Mormon stories, etc., I found out the truth and that the church wasn't true. I haven't left yet, but I'm on the verge. I'm second counselor in the bishopric. Bishopric member and full-time seminary teacher for 20 years, not technically a calling. Finally realizing that Joseph Smith's documented behavior was deplorable. Gospel doctrine teacher. We were studying the New Testament. I began having issues thinking that none of the apostles spent their ministry on earth preaching about building temples, sealings, work for the dead, special underwear, etc. All of the things the church claims were restored. This led me on a deep dive of church history. One night, I read multiple accounts of Joseph Smith sacrificing animals on his treasure digs, and I was out. Called the next morning to have me released from my callings. I had my name removed 3 months later. The church is a scam. I just recently read about those animal sacrifices, and I mean, I don't know a ton about it. From what it seems like, it's like kind of secondhand sources, but there's like multiple different sources claiming that Joseph Smith sacrificed animals, and not just like sacrificing goats or sheep, sacrificing dogs in treasure digging. You'll have to Google that and look into it. Let me know if you want. I can do a video about that maybe. I'll look further into it, but it is very interesting and very freaky. And also somehow not that surprising. I served quite a few years on the Stake High Council and later as a high priest group leader. I served for a cumulative 4 years as a temple ordinance worker. When I encountered the church history gospel topics essays with the footnotes and the cited sources, I recognized that spiritual experiences proved unreliable for me and for the prophets and apostles as a means to discern the truth, because they and I, individually and collectively, had spiritual experiences about many partially or entirely false things, and subsequently disavowed as false doctrines and teachings. I recognized that there never actually was such a thing as mantles of discernment for the brethren, nor what I had been promised about discernment and my patriarchal blessing. This recognition that experiences of spirit were something other than reliable divine witnesses of truth is what triggered an existential, a faith, and an identity crisis for me, because my very being had been enmeshed in the meanings I attributed to my spiritual experiences prior to that weekend in which I encountered the church essays. I also recognized from the information in the essays that the leaders of the church consciously chose to teach partially and entirely false things in order to protect faith and heritage, and that violated my core moral values. Additionally, as I studied the essays, the footnotes, and from the cited sources, I recognized that the church was spinning narratives that in many cases misrepresented the footnotes and cited sources, and they intentionally excluded information in order to mislead the reader. Which, by the way, can I just pause for 1 second, is what the church and its members constantly accuse anti-Mormons of doing every time they write or say anything. So in addition to an acute existential, a faith, and an identity crisis all at once, I recognized that the brethren and the church not only had been dishonest in the past, but they were dishonest with many things in the very essays that were supposed to be a shift towards increased honesty and transparency. It felt like spiritual abuse, that they knew we trusted them and they gave us polished and misleading narratives, and they testified to us that when we experienced the Spirit, that meant these polished and misleading things were literally confirmed by God as true. In spite of this, I didn't want to lose my community, my marriage, and my friends, so I had continued to attend for a time. Eventually, I recognized that the brethren will not likely ever be honest in my lifetime, and it violated my internal core moral values to continue to be a member of record. About 20 months after I lost my faith when I encountered the essays, I submitted my formal resignation to the church. Primary president. I was advocating for survivors of abuse for years before I left. I spent countless hours trying to educate the leaders on the dangers of telling women to stay in abusive marriages, and they just kept protecting and supporting the abusers. I also realized during that time that there wasn't a difference between Warren Jeffs and Joseph Smith, and I left. Elders Quorum president, ward mission leader, and member of the stake high council were probably my most important callings. My wife shared the CES letter with me, which crushed some of my belief. Her issues with the patriarchy, like when she shared that she hated the temple, played the biggest role. The nail in the coffin was when I tried to discuss my concerns with our bishop, and he admitted he had never read the Gospel Topics essays, and he couldn't speak intelligently to any of my questions. Same. My bishop had no idea what I was talking about. Instead, he just kept trying to use thought-stopping techniques to end our discussion. I had been uncomfortable for years, but those were the final steps to convincing me the church wasn't true. Relief Society president, twice. I left the church because I started studying abusive relationships and realized I was in one with the church. I had countless callings throughout the years. Highest would include primary presidency, secretary for many years when my children were young, and Relief Society presidency, first counselor in my BYU I ward. I would have never seen myself leaving, and I was one that prided myself on my strong testimony. Like many others, I was consistent, saying there was nothing that could change my testimony. Long story short, my experiences through the years in MLM, multi-level marketing, led me to research cult tactics and the manipulation that cults use. Once I began to see the parallels and realized the religion I was in was definitely using cult tactics, I told my husband and kids we were never going back, even if it was true. I later learned things that proved it wasn't true, but that was after I had already decided we couldn't go back. Gospel doctrine teacher, returned missionary. Left the church after my daughter was born, started learning how much of the church history was whitewashed and how many of the core doctrines and practices were just there to keep members afraid of losing everything if they step out of line. Biggest reason to leave was not wanting my daughter to be raised in a shame culture. I was bishop for 6.5 years, started deconstructing Mormonism after about 4 years into that calling. What started it for me was a conversation I had with a young man who wanted to talk about his struggles with same-sex attraction. During our conversation, he said to me that he hears his friends pray, and they would always pray to meet someone they can fall in love with and go to the temple with. When he prayed, he asked to never fall in love because he didn't want to choose between love and the church. I was never a fan of the church's LGBT policies, but this was the first time I saw firsthand how the church harms people. I was crushed. Shortly after that, we had a scout leader molest a young boy, and I saw how little the church cared for the victim and how much they cared about controlling the narrative and protecting the church. I was pretty much agnostic after that, but I was too scared to speak up at that time. I wish I had the courage then to speak out. I've been done with the church now for about 3 years. At age 76, I am still a member, though not believing since seeing your first video, having served in 2 bishoprics, 2 high councils, various ward and stake missionary positions. I'm mostly out because the truth claims are too doubtful. It's quite funny, but my calling accelerated my leaving the church. I've always been a bit of a nerdy guy, and science has always been something I've enjoyed and cared about. I started having doubts when the things I was taught in church directly contradicted scientific reality. I think the leaders saw I was drifting away, so I was called to be the teachers' quorum president. I felt I had no choice but to accept, but as someone who didn't really believe anymore, I felt very dishonest accepting a position of leadership and authority. After a few weeks of feeling totally miserable, I got a meeting with the bishop where I informed him that I was no longer believing in the church and that it felt like it was wrong to have someone who is growing to despise the organization have any kind of calling with it. I was released, and a few weeks later I formally resigned. Thank you so much to everybody who shared. And what I'm really hoping that people will get from this, what I'm hoping you will take from hearing from people who left the church, the reasons they did and the callings that they held, is that people who leave the church, these are your bishops. These are your primary teachers. These are your ward choristers, your Relief Society presidents, your high counselors, even your members of the 70. These are your missionaries, your ward clerks, your seminary teachers. People who leave the church typically have the same amount of faith as your average Mormon. We were just as much a part of this community as anybody. We're not these lazy learners that the church purports us to be. When the church dehumanizes people who leave the church by name calling or by implying that they're not as smart or that they're not as faithful or that they're different in some way, that is black and white thinking that is dividing us. When they say that we've been led astray by Satan, when they say that we are influenced by evil, when they say things like that, that is dividing us in a way that I feel is extremely harmful. A lot of the hate comments I get from Mormons, it comes across to me, and I'm sure to others, as somebody who truly does believe that we are other, that we are separate, that we are different, that we have nothing in common. I really hope that if you have made it this far into the video and you've listened to these stories, that you can understand that those of us who chose to leave the church had good reasons for doing so. We were not somebody who just wanted to sin. We are not these people who are just dirty, filthy apostates who've listened to Satan and decided to throw our faith away. We are your teachers, your leaders, your neighbors, your friends, fellow brothers and sisters. And we chose to leave the church because often we find it incongruous with our moral values. Anyway, if you got something out of this video, if you enjoyed it, make sure to leave a like and a comment. Thank you again to everybody who shared their story. And if you want to share your story too, please do so in the comments. I would love to hear from more people. Huge thank you to my patrons for supporting the channel. You guys are the best. And extra special thank you to Amy, Doug Davis, and Tans for supporting at the Demon tier on my Patreon. If you would like to support the channel, there are links to do so in the description below, as well as links to all my other social media if you want to see more content. Thank you for being here, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!
I'll never tell.
Yeah, I like you, that's for sure. Never have to close the door.